to another edition of History in a Drink. I'm Shawn.
And I'm Frank. And tonight we're going to be traveling to Nicaragua, and we're going to be trying a rum from there called Flor.
So now, a little bit about this season, you guys, for those of you who've been following along, Frank and I love rum. And so what we've been doing, we're back at the Baja Hut tonight. We've missed it for the last couple of weeks. They had a closing and Halloween, some other stuff, but we are back, and world famous tiki bar, the Baja Hut. We've been traveling around this season, starting in Florida. We went to Cuba, and we're traveling around and looking at different places around the Caribbean about their history and also to what they're drinking.
Exactly. And so tonight's drink is called the Sparkling Flor. All right. So Flor actually means sugarcane flour. And all of their drinks off their website, which is where I went to get this, have Flor in the name. So this one it's very simple. It's their 12-year-old rum. It is a little bit of carbonated water and an orange slice, and that's it.
Nice and simple. Cheers.
Cheers.
Delicious. In its simplicity. So Flor rum.
Mm-hmm. So like the rum we talked about last week, we see that it's a family-owned company, and it's been in this family for 5 generations.
Which that to be any company owned 5 generations is pretty crazy. So what they started back not in Nicaragua though. The actual owner of the company
is from Italy.
Italy, okay.
And he comes here. So Nicaragua, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but Nicaragua was a trade route from east to west before the canals were actually built. And the big time that really spurred on development there was when gold was found in California.
Because people had to get from the eastern side of the U.S. all the way to California. Instead of crossing all the way over the United States, they would actually go by ship. And Nicaragua, even though there was no direct river that cut across, there was a river system, and they would do river and then some caravans and stuff to go across.
Yeah, and so that is going to make it where he moved there to get into the business of selling stuff to the people traveling.
So that was 1875 that he came across there.
A little bit earlier.
Earlier than that, okay.
1830.
Yep.
Right? And what we'll see is he then decides to set up a distillery at the base of one of the volcanoes. Nicaragua is famous for its volcanoes. Mm-hmm. So this is the only distillery that I know that is at the base of an active volcano, and the volcano's name is San Cristobal.
Cristobal. Yep.
So they started in 1890, which was perfect timing because in that period we see that they're beginning to build the Panama Canal. All right.
So his business of cutting across Nicaragua kind of went blah because they could do everything now through the Panama Canal. And also to the railroad was going across the United States.
So he had to find something else to get in business with. And so he started making rum there. Yeah. And they began exporting rum in 1959. So we're talking a good 60, 70 years that they were just selling it in the country. They didn't have to sell it anywhere else, and really made a name for themselves there. Yeah. And then they started selling to other Caribbean countries, Costa Rica, Honduras, Venezuela. And then down the road, they then branched out and sold it in America and all over the world now. So the distillery was in its same form all the way until the 1960s.
Holy smokes, okay.
And in the 1960s, they began to modernize, but it took them almost 30 years to modernize. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until the 1990s that they finished their whole modernization of their facility. Now, that was because of conflict going on in Nicaragua.
Central America has got a lot of conflict going on, especially from the 1970s up through the 90s even.
Yeah, and that's part of the Iran-Contras and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. And so for about 10 years, all they were doing was making and storing rum. They weren't even selling it. So by 1990, they had the largest store of aged rum in the world.
Holy smokes.
And this is when they really then start flooding it out in the market. And they have really long aged rum. So they're known for, they have a 25-year-old rum that you can get. And then they have an 18-year-old and a 12-year-old. And then everything else is below that, like 4 and 6 years and stuff. Yeah. but the 25-year-old must be incredible.
Absolutely. So, and amazing that they could have it that long to be able to store to do it. So that's Florida Canal rum. So still going great today, and obviously from Nicaragua. Let's talk a little bit about Nicaragua.
All right. So Nicaragua, the thing that I want to talk about there is there was an attempt to build a canal across Nicaragua multiple times.
So the Panama Canal is what kind of was famous. Once again, people, if you're taking a big ship and you're going around, you'd have to go all the way down around South America and come all the way up the other side. There was no cut through until the Panama Canal.
Right. So Nicaragua was going to be the competition to the Panama Canal, because the Panama Canal was actually started by the French. And at that point, it was part of Colombia.
Okay.
All right. And the Americans, based on the Monroe Doctrine, believed that the Western Hemisphere is ours. And no European should be involved and stuff like that. So what they're going to do is they're going to build a bigger and better one in Nicaragua.
Okay.
And actually, the geography of Nicaragua is going to help build the Panama Canal, because in the middle of it, there's this huge lake. And so all they had to do was build a set of locks. It was roughly 30 miles from the ocean to the lake. Then the ships could go on the lake, and then they could do another set of locks that then hooked them to the San Juan River.
And that was in Panama?
No, this is in Nicaragua.
Okay.
And then they could use the San Juan River for part of it. And so they didn't have to build as much, right? But estimated cost of the canal to build is, in that period of time, $138 million.
Okay.
If we put that in today's dollars, it's $4.9 billion to build it, right? So that's going to be the American attempt. Now, like so many things the French do, they fail at building the canal, and the investors who were going to go and build it in Nicaragua see that they can grab the canal rights for $40 million.
And not have to rebuild the second canal. And
right.
They could just jump on the first one.
Right.
And get it going.
Now, here's where the kind of the crappy part of the story comes in. So Nicaragua in the early part of the 20th century was a democratic country, had a democratically elected leader named Zelaya. And Zelaya wanted to really kind of create a United States of the Central America, and unify El Salvador and Nicaragua and Honduras and Costa Rica all together into one country. But that also goes against the Monroe Doctrine, right? And
which the Monroe Doctrine is America take over everything
in the Western Hemisphere.
In the Western Hemisphere.
And so the Americans are going to ultimately pay all of his rivals money to run, and they're going to overthrow him. And what it's going to do is it's going to push Nicaragua into a civil war.
Affecting elections even in that day.
Exactly, and big time affecting elections. So they are going to attempt to do that. And what he was doing is he still wanted to go through with the canal project, even though the Americans were going there. So he was looking to the Germans and the Japanese for that. Just imagine if the Germans and the Japanese had built a canal there and then did what the Americans did, which took the rights to that area and built military bases around it, how that could have changed, especially World War I and then later World War II.
World War II even,
Yeah. Because the Panama Canal is so vital in World War II for the Americans to get fleets back and forth between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Now, Zelaya, I've read actually a lot about him, and he's a really interesting character. All he wanted to do was make his country better, give his people the same kind of freedoms that he saw in America and stuff like that. And because it went against the United States economic imperialism of the early part of the 20th century, he gets removed. Ultimately, it leads to a whole bunch of military dictators in charge. And then the U.S. Marines go in 1913 and occupy Nicaragua until the 1930s, I think till 1936. Then we put a dictator in that we want, and on and off for the next 50 years. And then he gets overthrown, and that's when we get the Contras and all that kind of stuff.
Ollie North and everything going on with that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Now, the thing that really got the Americans to not vote for this canal was a tiny little postage stamp.
Okay.
All right. So on the stamp, it was for 1 cent, and it was the famous volcano that's in Nicaragua named Momotombo.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's got a little puff of smoke coming out of it, and then it's got traditional stuff in front of it. Well, it's that puff of smoke that this guy named Cromwell, who was hired by the French to get the American Senate to buy the Panama Canal rights.
Exactly. And basically to poo-poo on Nicaragua.
Right.
To do it.
And he got paid $800,000 to do this, which is roughly about $28 million to get the Senate to vote for the acquisition of the rights to the Panama Canal area instead of building it in Nicaragua.
So how did the puff of smoke come into place?
Because what he said to them is that this is an active volcano and that there is going to be an eruption soon. And if that happens, it's going to cause chaos to the locks. It's going to destroy them. Yeah. It's going to ruin the railroad. We could see like mini tsunamis in Lake Managua and all of this stuff. And in 1932...
So we're seeing negative marketing even in those days.
Yep. In 1932 on Martinique, there is a huge volcano eruption in the Caribbean that kills 30,000 people on Martinique. And that is going to kind of solidify it. And he kind of gets to be able to say, I knew this was going to happen, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So he used that stamp in the information that he was passing out, and then he leaked it to the newspapers as well, and the newspapers were putting it in there. Why would we want to spend our money on a canal, buy an active volcano and all of this stuff, and got the people to do it? And it was a very close vote. They only voted it down by 4 votes in the Senate.
Oh, smokes.
Okay. Right? And the acquisition of the Panama Canal was only by 8 votes in the Senate at the time. So that was pretty significant to see that between the two of them.
Which would have been a drastic difference to have a canal through Nicaragua versus Panama.
Exactly.
Kind of the butterfly effect that the little tiny thing had a huge implication even to today.
Yeah. So in the 1930s, there was another survey of the area to see about building a canal again. And this one goes back to the idea of the 49ers going to the gold rush.
Okay.
And this guy, his name is Sultan, is his last name. He's in the Army Corps of Engineers. He is doing the survey with his team of 300 men. And what they did is they surveyed the route that the miners took across to build the canal in that same route, because it was the quickest one across. And so that became known as the 49er route, right, across. And in that attempt, what they were going to do is they were going to build the canal much larger than the Panama Canal. So the Panama Canal can take ships up to 65,000 tons.
Okay.
All right. So at the time, there weren't really ships bigger than that. And during World War II, the United States, their battleships, the last class of them, the Iowa class, are actually built to fit in those locks.
Specifically for that.
Yeah, they have 1 inch on each side, and I think 2 inches front to back for each lock. But that was part of the makeup part. Yeah. Now they were going to increase the size of this so it would be 250,000 tons. And what this would do is, especially starting in the 1970s and stuff like that, we began to see these super tankers.
Yeah.
And they're too big to go through the canal. And realistically, there's also these huge natural gas ships that transport that around the world. Mm-hmm. Now, personally, I don't really want to be near a natural gas or an oil tanker that's going through a canal.
Probably not.
In today's world. But that was what they were trying to do, is to be able to move those through. Because you have to remember, Venezuela is one of the OPEC countries, and they export a tremendous amount of oil, and they were looking at sending it to China. Yeah. Right? Then in the early 2000s, China gets in on this. So they attempt to build a canal as well, and they buy the rights to it, and it's really being pushed by a millionaire or a billionaire named Wang Jing, and he gets all of the stuff working, get all the legal matters, all of that stuff, and then there's a recession in China, and he loses about 80% of his wealth.
Okay.
So it goes flat.
Again.
Yeah.
So the Panama Canal, though, is currently just as it was when it was built.
Correct.
And so we still can't put those big ships through. They have to travel all the way around,
right,
or work their way through.
They call a ship that can't go through it a Panamax.
Panamax?
Yeah, because it's too big for the Panama Canal.
Gotcha.
All right. And so causing that to stall, that was the last attempt that we've seen about it. But this idea is talked about in lots of books. One of my favorite authors, Clive Cussler, in one of his books, he's got it where the bad guys are building an underground tunnel to transport goods from Lake Managua to the ocean.
Gotcha.
And he puts in the volcano and the eruption and all of that kind of stuff in there as part of it.
What book is that?
I'll have to look it up. I don't remember which one exactly.
It's Clive Cussler.
Yeah.
I've read several of them.
So it's in a lot of pulp cultures today still.
Yeah.
So I think it would be really kind of cool to go there and visit and see where Flor is, but actually get to travel and see where this canal should have been built.
And while you were talking about, especially literary and authors and stuff, one of my favorite authors to read is actually a local guy down here in Florida, is Randy Wayne White. If anybody's never read Randy Wayne White, he's phenomenal. Writes a little bit more kind of like spy kind of stuff. And he actually has a character by the name of Doc Ford, who's a marine biologist, but he worked for the CIA, so he's got some training and stuff. And he spent a lot of time in Nicaragua, and he refers to Flor rum as his favorite rum in the novel. So it's a great rum afterwards. So, but I think that about covers our Nicaragua tonight.
Correct.
So great history about how it is still in process and almost had a canal like Panama through. Talked about Flor rum, and we're going to do, for those of you who are here, we're going to be doing trivia following our little broadcast here for the guys who are out. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Hopefully you learned a little something tonight. Where are we traveling to next week?
Next week, I believe we're going to Barbados.
Oh, okay.
Right? And we're going to try some of the rum from there.
Fantastic little history on that place. So,
exactly.
You bet. Thank you guys for coming on out, and we'll see you next week. Thank you guys so much for coming on out.
All right.